The night of my return to the country was warm but restless. The city lights flickered like a million tiny eyes watching, waiting. As my car wove through the streets, my chest felt hollow, empty but not entirely unburdened. 7 years had passed. 7 years since Vernon shattered my world. 7 years since I left, carrying the weight of a broken engagement and an even more broken heart. But time had done its work. I had moved on. Or at least, I thought I had. My friends, ever loyal, insisted on throwing a grand welcome party for me at the most luxurious clubhouse in town. I let them. Not because I wanted the attention, but because I wanted to prove, to them, to him, and most of all, to myself, that I was no longer the girl who had been cast aside like an unwanted doll. The party was in full swing when I arrived. Champagne flowed freely, laughter and music filled the air, and I was immediately surrounded by familiar faces. Some I had missed. Others were mere remnants of a past life. I was making small talk, exchanging pleasantries when I felt it. A shift in the atmosphere. A sudden hush that spread like wildfire. Then, I saw him. Vernon Helling Toll. He stood near the bar, his tall frame draped in an immaculate suit, his presence as commanding as ever. His face, one I once memorized with foolish devotion, was still breathtakingly handsome. But there was something else. Something new. A coldness in his eyes. A stiffness in his posture. The man who had once burned with passion for a woman he had fought the world for now looked hollow. Empty. And standing beside him was Ivy. The woman for whom he had thrown away everything, me, our engagement, the long-standing bond between our families. Ivy, who had once been a delicate, timid girl, now carried herself with the forced elegance of someone trying too hard to belong. Her face, pale under the dim chandelier light, was carefully composed, but I caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. Vernon's gaze met mine. 1,000 memories collided in that instant. The whispered promises, the nights spent dreaming of a future together, the betrayal, the humiliation of watching him declare to the world that he would rather marry a stranger than be bound to me. I clenched my fingers around the stem of my wine glass, willing my heartbeat to steady. I had prepared for this moment. I had convinced myself that it wouldn't matter. That he was nothing more than a relic of my past. But as I watched him take slow, deliberate steps toward me, the ghost of that pain stirred in my chest. "Claire," he said, his voice smooth yet distant. "So many years have passed. I was young and impulsive back then, and I said some thoughtless things that hurt you." He smiled, as if we were old friends reconnecting over coffee. I wanted to take the liberty of hosting tonight's party as an apology. Apology. The word hung in the air, heavy and insincere. I forced a polite smile, mirroring the detached grace I had mastered over the years. "As you said, it's all in the past." I raised my glass slightly, my voice steady. "After all, we are from the same circle. There's no harm in letting bygones be bygones." His eyes darkened at my indifference. For a split second, I thought I saw something, regret. Longing, but it disappeared before I could dissect it. "I heard you and Ivy got married over a year ago," I continued smoothly, lifting my glass. "I'm sorry I didn't congratulate you at the time. This toast is for you." Vernon's jaw tightened. He lifted his own glass, but instead of clinking it against mine, he downed the entire drink in one go. It wasn't an act of celebration. It was as if he was drowning something, perhaps his own regret. The air between us thickened. Around us, the chatter resumed, but there was a shift. An undercurrent of tension. People were watching. Whispering. Ivy, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke, her voice light but strained. "Claire, it's been a long time. How have you been?" I turned to her, meeting her gaze with the same polite detachment. "I've been well. Paris treated me kindly." "That's wonderful," she said, but her fingers trembled slightly against the stem of her wine glass. She was uneasy. Why? Before I could dwell on it, the party resumed its natural rhythm. Conversations floated around me, questions about my career, my life in Paris, my success. I answered them all effortlessly, aware of Vernon's lingering gaze. Then, he spoke again. I went to see your show at Paris Fashion Week, he admitted, his tone almost too casual. A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. Did you? He nodded, swirling the last drops of wine in his glass. It was impressive. I was saved from replying by a sudden commotion at the entrance. Everyone turned as the doors swung open, revealing a woman standing just outside the hall. Her face was as pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with something bordering on terror. Ivy. But she had been here just moments ago. So why was she now standing at the entrance, looking like she had seen a ghost? The room fell silent. Ivy's gaze locked onto me, then flickered to Vernon. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hands, delicate and adorned with rings, clutched at the fabric of her dress as if seeking stability. It was only then that I realized something was terribly, terribly wrong. And I had a feeling it had everything to do with me. The silence that followed was suffocating. The entire room, once buzzing with laughter and polite chatter, had now turned into a vacuum of uneasy whispers and stolen glances. Ivy stood frozen at the entrance, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Vernon's expression turned unreadable. His grip on his empty glass tightened, the veins in his hands subtly surfacing under the dim light. For a man who had once sworn his life to Ivy, his face now reflected nothing but cold detachment. I took a slow sip of my wine, watching the scene unfold as an observer rather than a participant. 7 years ago, the sight of Ivy and Vernon together would have been a blade to my chest, but now I only felt a strange curiosity, a sense that something was deeply amiss. Then Ivy moved. Her steps were hesitant, as though she was walking into a battlefield rather than a grand reception. She stopped a few feet away from me and Vernon, her breath unsteady. Her gaze flickered between us, searching for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps an answer to a question only she knew. Ivy, I greeted, my tone measured. You look like you've seen a ghost. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Vernon scoffed, low and sharp. You knew about the party. Don't act so surprised. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Eyes darted back and forth between the three of us. Ivy flinched, as though Vernon's words had struck a nerve. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and hurt. I was waiting for you, she said quietly, almost pleadingly. You didn't say you'd be coming. I don't need permission to attend a party, Vernon replied, his voice void of emotion. There it was again, that unfamiliar coldness in him. This wasn't the man who had defied his family and destroyed our engagement just to be with Ivy. The Vernon I had once known would have never spoken to her with such indifference. What happened to you two? The question left my lips before I could stop it. Ivy snapped her gaze to me, her fingers trembling as she clutched her wrist. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Vernon set his glass down on the bar with a sharp clink. That's none of your concern, Claire. He didn't sound angry. Just resigned. As if whatever had happened was already set in stone. Ivy, on the other hand, looked anything but composed. Her eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape. Finally, she let out a weak chuckle and smoothed down the fabric of her dress, attempting to regain some semblance of control. Yes, of course, she murmured. None of her concern. Despite her words, her hands betrayed her. She was nervous, afraid, even. The whispers in the room grew louder, speculation rippling through the air. I had no intention of entertaining the gossip, but something about Ivy's demeanor struck me as wrong. I decided to take my leave before I got tangled in a drama that wasn't mine. It was nice seeing you both again, I said, offering a polite nod before turning toward the exit. But before I could take a step, Ivy's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. Claire, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, don't go just yet. The raw emotion in her voice made me pause. I glanced down at her hand and then back into her wide, troubled eyes. It was the first time I had ever seen Ivy so unguarded, so vulnerable. Vernon stiffened beside us, his entire posture rigid. What's wrong, Ivy? I asked carefully. She hesitated, her fingers loosening their hold on me. Then she exhaled shakily and did something unexpected. She looked at Vernon, not with love, not with longing, but with something eerily close to fear. And for the first time that evening, a chill ran down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. Ivy's trembling fingers loosened from my wrist, but the echo of her touch lingered on my skin like a ghostly imprint. Her face was pale, her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. She looked not just anxious, but trapped, like a bird that had flown into a glass cage, only now realizing it had no way out. Vernon, on the other hand, remained still. Too still. His expression, once unreadable, now settled into something dangerously close to irritation. I could feel his growing impatience in the sharp line of his jaw, the rigid tension in his shoulders. Ivy, he said, his voice calm but edged with warning. You're making a scene. She flinched as though he had struck her, and my stomach twisted at the sight. 7 years ago, this was the man who had defied the world for her. The man who had cast me aside without hesitation, declaring his undying love for her. And now, he stood before her, offering nothing but cold detachment. Whatever had happened in their marriage had shattered the illusion of the love they once shared. And yet, Ivy wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. I took a step back, putting some distance between us. If something is wrong, Ivy, you should speak up. She opened her mouth, but before she could utter a word, Vernon's hand wrapped around her wrist, gently, yet firm enough that she wouldn't slip away. Enough, he murmured, his voice laced with finality. We're leaving. Ivy's eyes darted between me and Vernon, panic rising in them. She shook her head, trying to pull free, but he didn't budge. Instead, his grip tightened. Vernon, let her go, I said, my voice steady. For the first time since I returned, Vernon's gaze locked onto mine with something unreadable. Claire, you don't know what you're talking about. This has nothing to do with you. But it did. The moment Ivy reached for me, the moment she pleaded with her eyes, whether she spoke the words or not, it became my concern. She doesn't want to leave, I said, watching his every move. And you shouldn't force her. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You think you understand everything just because you came back from Paris with a degree and a fancy career? The words were a direct hit, but they bounced off me like rubber bullets. I wasn't the same girl he had left behind all those years ago. I had survived without him. I had built my own life from the ruins of what he destroyed. But Ivy, she was still standing in those ruins, trapped. This isn't about me, I said coolly. This is about you. About whatever mess you've gotten yourself into. And about Ivy. So, if she needs help, she doesn't, Vernon cut in sharply. She's my wife. And she knows better than to, I know better than to what? Ivy's voice cut through his like a knife, brittle yet defiant. For the first time that night, she pulled her wrist from his grasp and took a step away from him. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Vernon looked at her, his expression unreadable, but something flashed in his eyes, something dark. You know better than to embarrass me like this. Embarrass him? A bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. Is that what you care about now? Appearances? Vernon's jaw tightened, but before he could say anything, Ivy turned to me. Claire, can we talk? Alone? Vernon took a step toward her, his presence looming. Ivy. She hesitated, but then, for the first time that night, she met his gaze without fear. I need to speak with her. Please. Something flickered in his expression, annoyance, maybe frustration, but after a beat, he exhaled sharply and stepped back. Fine, he said, but the word carried a weight that felt anything but agreeable. Ivy turned to me, her lips pressing together as she gestured toward the balcony. Without a word, I followed her, acutely aware of the way every pair of eyes in the room followed our departure. The night air was cool against my skin, a welcome contrast to the suffocating tension inside. I leaned against the railing, waiting for Ivy to speak. She took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening into fists at her sides. Claire, I don't know who else to turn to. I studied her carefully. What's going on, Ivy? She hesitated, glancing back at the doorway as if making sure Vernon wasn't within earshot. Something's not right with him. He's not the man I married. I don't know who he is anymore. I folded my arms, my gut twisting. I've noticed. But what exactly do you mean? She opened her mouth, but then the door behind us swung open. Vernon stood there, his silhouette framed by the golden glow of the party inside. His expression was eerily calm, but his eyes were like a storm brewing on the horizon. That's enough, he said, stepping onto the balcony. Ivy stiffened beside me. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't the only one trapped in this twisted game. Ivy was too. And Vernon was the one holding the strings. Vernon's presence loomed over us like a storm cloud, dark and foreboding. The tension on the balcony was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Ivy, who had just begun to find her voice, fell silent, her hands clenching at the fabric of her dress as though grasping onto the last vestiges of control. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply met Vernon's gaze, unwavering and unafraid. That's enough, he said again, his voice calm but edged with a quiet threat. Is it? I countered, tilting my head slightly. Because from where I'm standing, it seems like Ivy has more to say. Ivy shot me a desperate look, and I knew she was torn. Torn between the person she had become with Vernon and the truth clawing its way to the surface. Vernon exhaled sharply, stepping forward. Claire, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is my marriage. You don't get to interfere. I crossed my arms, refusing to back down. And I don't know what's happening between you two, but if Ivy is asking for help, I'm not about to ignore it. Ivy shook her head frantically, her expression begging me to let it go. But I couldn't, not when something felt so undeniably wrong. Vernon's jaw tensed. Ivy, come inside. Now. Her body tensed, every muscle in her frame wound tight like a coiled spring. She hesitated for just a second too long, and that hesitation spoke volumes. Ivy, I said gently, ignoring Vernon. If you don't want to go, you don't have to. Vernon's head snapped toward me, and for the first time, I saw it. The flicker of something behind his carefully controlled mask. Fear? Anger? Desperation? Whatever it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Ivy took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. I just need a moment. Vernon stared at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, as if deciding it wasn't worth the public spectacle, he stepped back, smoothing down the front of his jacket. Fine, he said coolly. But don't take too long. He turned on his heel and walked back inside, his presence vanishing into the warm glow of the party. But his absence did nothing to relieve the suffocating tension. Ivy let out a breath she had clearly been holding. Claire, you don't understand. Then explain it to me, I urged. What's going on? She shook her head, rubbing her arms as though she were suddenly cold. It's not that simple. Try me. Ivy looked around nervously, as if the very walls had ears. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't catch it, she whispered, I think Vernon regrets everything. I frowned. Regrets what? She swallowed hard. Marrying me. That answer was not what I expected. I studied her carefully. If he regrets it, then why hasn't he? He can't, she interrupted, her voice carrying a weight of something deeper. Something unspoken. He won't. And I don't know why. A cold chill prickled down my spine. There was something Ivy wasn't telling me, something much bigger than just regret. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. Ivy, are you afraid of him? She hesitated. And then, the balcony doors swung open again. Vernon's voice was smooth, but his eyes were anything but. Ivy. Time's up. Ivy stiffened beside me. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't just witnessing the unraveling of their marriage. I was standing in the middle of something much darker. The silence that followed Vernon's words was deafening. Ivy stood motionless beside me, her fingers digging into her own arms as if trying to keep herself from trembling. I could see it clearly now, fear. Not the kind of fear one has in the face of sudden danger, but the quiet, suffocating terror of being trapped in a cage with no visible doors. Vernon's eyes flickered between us, a warning in his gaze. He wasn't just asking Ivy to leave, he was demanding it. The air around us felt thick, like we were all walking a tightrope above an abyss, one wrong step away from a fall that none of us could afford. Ivy, his voice was lower this time, dangerously calm. Let's go. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She cast a desperate glance at me, as if she were silently pleading for something, for help, for time, for an answer she didn't know how to voice. I stepped in front of her, blocking Vernon's path, my heartbeat steady but my mind racing. She said she needs a moment. Vernon's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides before he exhaled slowly. This isn't your concern, Claire. I didn't back down. Maybe not. But Ivy is. For a long moment, he just stared at me, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Then, slowly, he relaxed, stepping back with an air of forced patience. Fine, he said, though his tone made it clear that it was anything but fine. Take your time. With that, he turned and walked back inside, but the way he moved, the rigid tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to slam the door, told me he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Ivy let out a shaky breath, her entire body sagging like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. I reached out, touching her arm lightly. Ivy, what's going on? She shook her head quickly, her fingers fidgeting at the hem of her dress. I don't know how to explain it. Then start anywhere. She swallowed hard. Vernon wasn't always like this, she whispered. At first, after we got married, things were good. He was still the man I fell in love with, attentive, protective, kind. But something changed. I don't know when exactly. It was slow, so slow I didn't even realize it was happening until one day I looked at him and he was different. Different how? I asked, watching her closely. She licked her lips, struggling to find the words. Distant. Cold. Like he was keeping secrets. At first, I thought he was just stressed from work, but then I started noticing little things. He would leave at odd hours, without explanation. He started keeping his phone locked. And then, one night, I woke up and found him just staring at me. A chill ran down my spine. Staring at you? She nodded, her breath shallow. Not like someone looking at their wife. It was like he was looking through me. As if he was trying to figure something out. Ivy wrapped her arms around herself, as if she could ward off the memory. I tried to ask him about it, but he brushed it off, said I was imagining things. And maybe I was. I wanted so badly to believe him. But then he started getting angry over little things. And it wasn't just frustration, it was this quiet, controlled rage, the kind that never explodes but lingers, waiting for the right moment. I frowned, my instincts screaming that something was very, very wrong. Has he ever hurt you? She hesitated just a second too long. No, she said finally, but the way she said it didn't convince me. It sounded like a half-truth, or maybe something she was forcing herself to believe. Ivy, I said gently. If you're in danger, I'm not, she interrupted, shaking her head. At least, not yet. But I feel like I'm being watched. All the time. Even when Vernon isn't home, I feel it. My pulse quickened. Have you noticed anything strange? Things moving? Someone following you? She hesitated, then gave a small nod. A few times, I've come home and things felt off. Like someone had been there but hadn't taken anything. And there's this car. A black sedan. I've seen it parked near our house too many times to be a coincidence. I didn't like any of this. Not one bit. Ivy, you need to get out, I said firmly. If Vernon is controlling you, if someone is watching you, I can't, she whispered. Claire, you don't understand. Vernon won't let me. A lump formed in my throat. Then we'll find a way. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. How? Before I could answer, the balcony door creaked open again. Vernon stood in the doorway, his face cast in shadow, but I could feel his gaze burning into us. That's enough, he said, his voice low and edged with something dark. Ivy, come inside. This time, Ivy didn't hesitate. She turned to me, her lips pressing together in a tight line before she walked past me toward him. I clenched my fists, watching as Vernon placed a hand on her lower back, guiding her inside like nothing had happened. But something had happened. And I wasn't about to let it go. As they disappeared into the party, I made a silent vow. I would find out the truth. No matter what it took. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Conversations buzzed around me, laughter echoed from different corners of the room, but my mind remained locked on Ivy and Vernon. I could see them, across the room, acting like nothing had happened, like Ivy hadn't just confessed to me that she felt trapped, like Vernon hadn't just issued an unspoken warning with his cold stare. Something was very, very wrong. I needed to get to the bottom of it. As the night wound down, guests began filtering out of the venue, leaving behind only a handful of people lingering for final goodbyes. Ivy and Vernon were among them. I watched as Vernon politely excused himself to speak with a business associate, leaving Ivy standing alone near the fireplace. Now was my chance. I approached her cautiously. Ivy. She turned, startled, as if she hadn't expected me to come back to her. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her nails pressing into her skin. I meant what I said earlier, I whispered. You don't have to stay in this situation if you don't feel safe. Her lips trembled slightly before she exhaled shakily. Claire, it's complicated. I don't care how complicated it is, I said, my voice firm but gentle. If you need help, I will help you. Ivy glanced over her shoulder to make sure Vernon was still occupied, then turned back to me. Meet me tomorrow, she said in a hushed voice. At the old coffee shop on Belmont Street. Noon. I nodded, my pulse quickening. I'll be there. Before I could say more, she pulled away, disappearing into the crowd as Vernon's presence loomed closer. I watched as he reached for her hand, his grip looking just a little too firm, his voice carrying a hushed warning as he whispered something in her ear. She nodded stiffly, and together, they walked out of the venue. I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around my clutch. Tomorrow, I would get answers. The next day, I arrived at the coffee shop early, choosing a booth in the farthest corner where we wouldn't be easily seen. I ordered a coffee but barely touched it, my mind restless. Then Ivy arrived. She wore oversized sunglasses, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, and a beige coat that swallowed her petite frame. She slid into the booth opposite me, keeping her head low. You came, I said, trying to mask my concern. She nodded but didn't take off her sunglasses. I don't have much time. If Vernon finds out, he won't, I assured her. Tell me what's going on. She hesitated, fingers twitching against her cup. Claire, I don't know who he is anymore. I don't know if I ever really did. I leaned in closer. What do you mean? She took a deep breath, then lowered her sunglasses, revealing dark circles under her eyes. Vernon has been hiding things from me, big things. There's money missing from our accounts, properties I didn't even know existed, and people coming to our house late at night. I tried to ask him, but he always has an excuse. And then, she trailed off, glancing around nervously before continuing in a whisper. 2 weeks ago, I found a safe in his office. My heartbeat quickened. What was in it? I don't know, she admitted. It was locked. But the next day, when I went back to check again, it was gone. My stomach twisted. A safe filled with unknown contents, suddenly disappearing? That wasn't just suspicious, it was terrifying. Ivy, you need to leave him, I said. This isn't just about a bad marriage. This sounds dangerous. Tears welled up in her eyes. I can't, Claire. He won't let me. What do you mean he won't let you? My voice hardened. She swallowed hard. He's watching me. He knows where I go, who I talk to. And last night, after the party, he told me something that made my blood run cold. I waited, my breath shallow. He said, Ivy whispered, you don't leave me. Ever. A chill ran through me. Ivy, I have to go, she said suddenly, glancing toward the window. My eyes followed hers, and my heart stopped when I saw it. A black sedan. Parked across the street. Ivy gripped my wrist. Claire, promise me you'll be careful. Before I could protest, she slid out of the booth and hurried toward the exit, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. And as I watched the car's tinted window lower slightly, revealing a shadowed figure staring directly at me, I knew one thing for certain. I was now a part of this, whether I wanted to be or not. My breath hitched as the black sedan remained motionless across the street. The figure inside didn't move, but I could feel their gaze locked onto me, heavy and unrelenting. I forced myself to stay calm, not to let the fear show, but my mind was racing. Who was watching? Was it Vernon? Someone working for him? Or was this something even bigger than I had imagined? Ivy had just left, and I had no way to warn her. I pulled my phone out, my fingers trembling as I typed a quick message, "Are you safe?" No response. I clenched my jaw and slid my phone into my bag, trying to shake the unsettling feeling crawling up my spine. I needed to get out of here. Slowly, I reached for my coffee cup, using it as an excuse to scan the cafe for anything unusual. A few patrons sat scattered around the room, lost in their own conversations, oblivious to the storm brewing outside these walls. Then, the sedan's engine roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my coat, slung my bag over my shoulder, and walked out of the cafe as if I hadn't just noticed the car. As I stepped onto the pavement, I forced myself to breathe normally. The sedan pulled away from the curb, moving at a leisurely pace, following me. I turned the corner and walked briskly down the street. The sound of the car's tires rolling against the asphalt was steady, a predator stalking its prey. I couldn't lead them home. I needed to lose them first. My mind scrambled for a plan. The marketplace was 2 blocks away, crowded, noisy, unpredictable. If I could make it there, I might be able to disappear into the throng of people. I quickened my pace. The car matched it. A bead of sweat trailed down my back despite the chill in the air. I took another sharp turn, slipping into a narrow alleyway. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed my back against the cold brick wall, listening. The car didn't follow. I peered around the corner, expecting to see the sedan stopped at the alley's entrance, but it was gone. Just as quickly as it had appeared, it had vanished. That didn't feel like a victory. Swallowing my unease, I turned back onto the main road and made my way to my apartment, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. No sign of the car. No sign of anything unusual. But that didn't ease the tension in my chest. When I finally reached my building, I hesitated before going inside. Was I being paranoid? Or was I already in deeper than I realized? Once inside, I locked the door behind me and exhaled, my back pressed against the wooden surface. The apartment was quiet, still. Too still. Ivy's words echoed in my head, "You don't leave me. Ever." I closed my eyes and tried calling her. The phone rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. Something was wrong. I spent the next hour pacing, trying again and again to reach Ivy, but she never answered. The thought of going to her house crossed my mind, but if Vernon was there, it wouldn't be safe. I needed more information. I pulled out my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. If Ivy was right and Vernon was hiding things, money, property, secrets, then I needed to find proof. Something I could use to get her out of this mess. A deep breath. Then I started searching. I looked up the company he worked for, his financial history, anything I could get my hands on. It wasn't easy, Vernon had covered his tracks well, but after an hour of digging, I found something that made my blood run cold. A property. One that wasn't listed under his name but was connected to his business dealings. A small, private estate just outside the city. The kind of place that wasn't meant to be found. And Ivy had no idea it existed. My hands trembled as I copied down the address. I didn't know what I would find there, but one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let Ivy disappear into the shadows Vernon was weaving around her. I had to get to that estate. Before it was too late. The weight of the address I had just found sat heavy in my chest, pressing down like an invisible force. A private estate. Off the grid. Hidden under Vernon's business dealings. The implications of it all sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just about a failing marriage. This wasn't just about Ivy feeling trapped. This was something bigger. Something dangerous. I checked my phone again. Still no response from Ivy. My mind raced with possibilities. Was she with Vernon? Was she safe? Had she even made it home after leaving the coffee shop? The questions churned inside me, each one darker than the last. I needed to act. I couldn't just sit here, refreshing my phone, waiting for a call that might never come. I grabbed my coat, my bag, and the small pocketknife I kept for emergencies. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I wasn't going in blind. With one last deep breath, I left my apartment and hailed a cab. The driver barely spared me a glance as I gave him the address. He didn't question why I was heading to a location so far from the city. The ride stretched on in silence, the city lights fading behind us as we made our way deeper into the outskirts. The air outside grew colder, the landscape shifting from concrete to dense woods. The further we drove, the more uneasy I became. Finally, the car came to a stop in front of a heavy wrought iron gate. Beyond it, a winding road led into the darkness. I could barely make out the outline of a house in the distance, its windows dark. "This the place?" the driver asked, turning to look at me for the first time since I'd gotten in. I hesitated. My gut screamed at me to be careful, but I nodded anyway. "Yeah." He didn't seem convinced. "You sure you don't need me to wait?" I wanted to say yes. Every instinct I had told me I shouldn't be here alone. But I also knew I couldn't afford to have someone else involved. If Vernon, or whoever was behind this, was watching, I couldn't risk drawing attention. "I'll be fine," I lied. "Thanks." The driver gave me a skeptical look before pulling away, leaving me standing in the cold. The moment the cab's taillights disappeared, silence fell over the estate. No sound. No movement. Just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath, steeling myself before pushing open the gate. It groaned under the weight of rust and neglect. The gravel path crunched beneath my boots as I made my way toward the house, the looming structure growing larger with each step. The closer I got, the more I realized how strange it was. There were no lights. No signs of life. The windows were dark, the front porch empty. It didn't look like a place anyone lived, it looked abandoned. And yet, something told me it wasn't. I approached the door cautiously, my fingers tightening around the pocketknife in my coat. I knocked once. Then twice. No answer. I tried the handle. Unlocked. A fresh wave of unease rolled over me, but I pushed forward, stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, but there was no mistaking it, someone had been here recently. Faint footprints marred the wooden floor, leading deeper into the house. I followed them, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hallway stretched on in eerie silence, the only light coming from the moon filtering through cracked curtains. I moved slowly, careful not to make a sound. Then, a noise. A faint creak from somewhere upstairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Someone was here. Ivy? Or someone else? I took a step toward the staircase, the wood groaning beneath my weight. My fingers curled tighter around the knife, my other hand gripping my phone. My thumb hovered over the emergency dial, but I hesitated. If I called now, I'd lose whatever element of surprise I had. I had to see what I was dealing with first. I took another step. Then another. The second floor was darker, colder. The air here smelled stale, untouched. The doors lining the hallway stood ajar, revealing glimpses of empty rooms. But at the end of the hall, one door remained shut. And the creaking had come from behind it. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move forward. Every step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I hesitated only for a moment before reaching for the knob. The door swung open with a low groan. The room inside was nearly empty, save for a single wooden chair in the center. A chair with ropes hanging loosely around its arms. My stomach lurched. Someone had been restrained here. Recently. I stepped inside, my heart pounding against my ribs. The walls were bare, the air thick with something I couldn't quite place. And then I saw it. A single piece of paper, left on the chair. Ivy's name was scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. My blood turned to ice. I grabbed the note, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. Don't trust him. My breath caught in my throat. The words were hurried, desperate. A warning. But from who? Ivy? Someone else? Before I could process it, a sound from downstairs sent my pulse into overdrive. Footsteps. Someone had just entered the house. I spun around, heart hammering. I had seconds, maybe less, before whoever it was found me here. I stuffed the note into my pocket, gripping my knife tighter. The footsteps grew louder, moving with deliberate slowness, as if whoever was there knew I was inside. A shadow passed through the crack under the door. I had no choice. I turned, ran to the window, and shoved it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop to think. I swung my legs over the ledge and dropped to the ground below, landing hard on my side. Pain shot through my ribs, but I ignored it. I scrambled to my feet, bolting toward the trees just as a figure appeared in the window above me. I didn't stop. I ran, the note burning in my pocket, my mind racing. I didn't know who was in that house. I didn't know what they wanted. But one thing was clear. I wasn't supposed to leave alive. The night swallowed me whole as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the trees blurring around me. My feet pounded against the cold, damp earth, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't dare look back. I didn't have to. Whoever was in that house was right behind me, and I knew without a doubt that if they caught me, I wouldn't make it out of this alive. I clutched the note tighter in my pocket, its edges crumpling under my grip. Don't trust him. The words echoed in my mind, a relentless drumbeat of warning. But who had left it? And who was he? Vernon? Someone else? Someone worse? The trees thinned out as I reached the end of the forest, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. A single street lamp flickered in the distance, casting a pale glow over the deserted road. I could see a gas station a few hundred feet away, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Safety. Maybe. I forced my legs to move, pushing through the pain, sprinting toward the gas station. The sound of my own footsteps drowned out everything else until a hand clamped around my wrist. I screamed, twisting, my free hand lashing out with the pocketknife. The blade grazed something solid, and my attacker let go just long enough for me to yank myself free. I stumbled forward, heart pounding, and finally turned to see who had grabbed me. A man stood in the shadows, his face obscured by darkness, but I could see the glint of his eyes, the way he held himself, the quiet menace in his posture. Claire, he said, his voice low and unfamiliar. You shouldn't be here. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking but firm. He stepped forward, just enough for the dim light to reveal his face. I sucked in a sharp breath. He was older, late 40s maybe, with sharp features and dark eyes that bore into me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. That doesn't matter, he said. You need to leave. Right now. I shook my head, gripping the knife tighter. Not until you tell me what's going on. What is this place? Why is Ivy? His expression darkened. Ivy doesn't matter anymore. She's made her choice. You need to make yours. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? What choice? He exhaled sharply, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. You're in over your head, Claire. Go back to your life. Forget this ever happened. I can't do that, I said. Ivy's my friend. If she's in trouble, I won't walk away. A flicker of something, sympathy? Frustration crossed his face, but it was gone in an instant. Then you're making a mistake. He took another step toward me, and I backed up instinctively. But then, suddenly, his head snapped to the side. He cursed under his breath and grabbed my arm again, this time, not to stop me, but to shove me toward the gas station. Run, he ordered. Now. I didn't wait to argue. I ran. I burst into the gas station, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. The cashier, a bored-looking teenager, barely glanced up from his phone as I stumbled to the counter. You okay? He asked, not sounding particularly concerned. My voice came out in a rasp. I need a phone. Please. He sighed, sliding his own phone across the counter. Knock yourself out. I snatched it up, my fingers fumbling as I dialed Ivy's number. It rang. Once. Twice. Then, Claire? Her voice was a whisper, frantic. Relief flooded through me. Ivy, where are you? Are you safe? No, she said. Claire, you have to listen to me. I made a mistake. A muffled sound, like a struggle. Then a male voice, cold and sharp, she doesn't have time to talk. The line went dead. My stomach lurched. No, I redialed. No answer. The man from outside had warned me to walk away. I knew now that he hadn't been threatening me, he had been warning me. But it was too late for that. I couldn't turn back. I wasn't leaving without Ivy. I turned to the cashier. Do you know if there's a motel nearby? He raised an eyebrow. Yeah, couple miles down the road. Why? I need to stay somewhere for the night. He gave me a once-over, then shrugged. Suit yourself. Just watch out. Weird people hang around here. I didn't respond. I left the gas station, stepping into the cold night. The road stretched before me, dark and empty. I had nowhere to go. But I had a mission. And I wasn't going to stop until I found Ivy. No matter what it took. I didn't sleep that night. The motel room was dingy, its walls covered in faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. The bed sagged beneath me, but I couldn't force myself to lie down. Instead, I sat in the chair by the window, staring out into the night, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the road outside remained empty. I checked my phone for the 100th time. No messages. No missed calls. Ivy had disappeared, and no one was telling me where she was. I went over the last few hours in my head, trying to piece everything together. The abandoned house. The chair with the ropes. The note. The man in the shadows who had warned me to run. The way Ivy had sounded on the phone, frantic, desperate. And then that final voice. Cold. Detached. She doesn't have time to talk. I clenched my jaw. Who had been holding her? Vernon? Or was there someone else involved? The man outside the gas station had told me to walk away, but I was past that now. If they thought I was just going to forget Ivy and leave, they didn't know me at all. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I was going to that estate. I gathered what little I had, my phone, a flashlight, my pocketknife. It wasn't much, but I wasn't going in blind this time. I'd spent the night researching everything I could about Vernon's business dealings, trying to find any possible connection to the house in the woods. And I had found something. The estate wasn't just a random property. It was owned by a shell company, one that Vernon had ties to. And that wasn't all. The company had been making large cash transactions, untraceable, undocumented. Money being funneled somewhere. To someone. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I had a feeling that if I wanted answers, that house was where I'd find them. By the time I arrived at the edge of the woods, the sun was already climbing high into the sky. The trees cast long, wavering shadows across the ground, but I wasn't afraid of the forest. I was afraid of what was waiting for me on the other side. I parked my car a mile away from the estate and made the rest of the journey on foot. I moved carefully, sticking to the trees, making sure I wasn't being followed. The house appeared through the gaps in the branches, dark, imposing, its shutters drawn tight. It looked abandoned, just like before. But I knew better now. Someone had been inside that night. Someone had been watching. I reached the back of the property, crouching low as I examined the house. There was a door on the side, half hidden by overgrown ivy. It looked old, barely used. That was my way in. Taking a steadying breath, I moved toward it. The knob turned easily in my hand, and I slipped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and something else, something faint but unmistakable. A metallic scent that made my stomach twist. Blood. I forced myself to stay calm. The house was just as empty as before, the furniture covered in white sheets, the air thick with silence. But something was different this time. The footprints in the dust had multiplied. Someone had been here, moving through these halls. And they hadn't been alone. I moved carefully, stepping over the creaking floorboards, making my way back toward the stairs. That was where I had found the note last time. If Ivy had left me one message, maybe there was another. I reached the door at the end of the hall. The one that had been shut before. The one that had led to the chair with the ropes. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, from behind me, a floorboard creaked. I spun, my heart leaping into my throat. A shadow moved at the other end of the hall. I barely had time to react before something slammed into me, knocking me backward. My head hit the doorframe, sending stars exploding behind my eyes. I struggled, kicking, clawing, trying to push away whoever was on top of me, but they were strong. Too strong. A rough hand clamped over my mouth. Not a sound. The voice was low, edged with danger. Panic surged through me. I thrashed harder, my nails digging into skin, my knees slamming upward. My attacker grunted, loosening their grip just enough for me to twist free. I stumbled to my feet, backing against the wall, my vision swimming. And then I saw him. Not Vernon. Not the man from the gas station. Someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. Tall, lean, dressed in black, his eyes sharp and assessing. He wasn't just some random thug. He was trained. Controlled. He wiped blood from his lip where I had scratched him, his expression unreadable. "You should have stayed away," he said. I clenched my fists. "Where's Ivy?" He tilted his head, considering me. "She's alive. For now." A cold rush of fear swept through me. "Let me see her." He smirked. "Not how this works." I forced myself to stay calm. "Vernon. Is he the one behind this?" The man chuckled. "You really think he's the one pulling the strings?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had assumed this was all about Vernon. That he had trapped Ivy in something she couldn't escape. But if this man was telling the truth, then Vernon wasn't the one in control. And that meant the danger was much, much bigger than I had realized. I took a step forward, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. "Who are you?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Doesn't matter." Before I could react, something hard struck the side of my head. A burst of pain flared through my skull, and the world tilted violently. Darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke, I was no longer in the house. I was in a car. My wrists were bound, my head throbbing. The engine rumbled beneath me, the low hum vibrating through my bones. I forced my eyes open, my vision blurring, slowly sharpening. I wasn't alone. The man from the house sat beside me, staring out the window as the car sped down a dark, winding road. Another man sat in the driver's seat, his face obscured by shadows. I swallowed hard, testing the restraints. Tight. Unyielding. The man beside me finally turned, meeting my gaze. "You wanted answers, didn't you?" I glared at him. "Where are you taking me?" His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. To meet the man in charge. A chill ran down my spine. Vernon had been just the beginning. And I was about to find out just how deep this nightmare really went. The world outside the speeding car blurred into streaks of darkness and flickering lights. The road stretched ahead like an endless tunnel, twisting and turning through the unknown. I forced my breathing to slow, my wrists burning against the ropes that bound them. Every shift, every movement, sent jolts of pain up my arms, but I refused to let them see my discomfort. The man beside me, the one who had knocked me out, watched me in silence. His sharp eyes were calculating, his posture too relaxed for someone who had just abducted a person. He was confident, in control, and that made him even more dangerous. "Where are we going?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the pounding in my head. He smirked. "Somewhere you don't belong." I clenched my jaw, forcing my pulse to steady. "If you're going to kill me, just do it already." He let out a quiet chuckle. "Who said anything about killing you?" My stomach churned. That was worse. If they didn't want me dead, it meant they had plans. And plans meant I was going to be trapped in something far bigger than I had imagined. The driver, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. "We should be there in 10 minutes. The man beside me nodded. "Good." I swallowed hard. My mind raced, analyzing every possible escape. The ropes were tight, but maybe, just maybe, I could work my wrists free. If I could just get one hand loose, a sharp tug on the ropes brought me back to reality. My captor had caught my subtle movements. He leaned in, his voice just above a whisper. "Don't try it." I met his gaze, unflinching. "Try what?" He tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "You're clever, but not clever enough. You're going to meet the man in charge, and if you behave, you might even live through it." I suppressed a shiver. The way he said it wasn't a threat. It was a fact. The car slowed, the headlights illuminating a massive wrought iron gate. Beyond it, a sprawling estate loomed against the night sky, its silhouette jagged and imposing. Whoever owned this place wasn't just powerful. They wanted the world to know it. The gate creaked open, and we drove through. My heart pounded as we approached the mansion, a structure so large it could house a small army. Lights burned in the windows, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. The car stopped. The driver turned off the engine, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, the door beside me swung open. Out. I hesitated. The man beside me didn't give me a choice. He grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. I stumbled, my legs still weak from the hit to my head. The cold night air bit into my skin, but I barely noticed. My eyes were locked on the grand entrance ahead. 2 guards stood by the double doors, their expressions unreadable. They didn't acknowledge me as I was led past them, through the towering doors, and into a marble-floored foyer. A crystal chandelier hung above us, its golden light illuminating the vast space. Everything about this place screamed wealth. Power. Control. Move. I was pushed forward, guided down a long hallway lined with expensive paintings and statues. Every detail of this place was calculated, designed to intimidate. Finally, we reached a pair of heavy wooden doors. My captor knocked once, then pushed them open. Inside, a man sat behind a massive desk, his hands folded neatly before him. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, but there was no mistaking the authority in his gaze. His suit was perfectly tailored, his expression one of quiet amusement. "Claire," he said smoothly. "I've been expecting you." I forced myself to stand tall, despite the ropes biting into my wrists. "Then you know I'm not going to make this easy for you." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I never expected you to." My captor pushed me into a chair across from the man. He then stepped back, standing guard at the door like a soldier waiting for orders. The man behind the desk studied me, his piercing gaze unwavering. "You've been asking a lot of questions. Poking around in places you shouldn't. I just want to know where Ivy is." His smile didn't waver. "And if I told you she's perfectly fine?" I narrowed my eyes. "Then I'd know you were lying." He let out a soft sigh, leaning back in his chair. "You're not stupid." "That's good. I appreciate intelligence. But intelligence also gets people into trouble." I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. He gestured to my captor. "Untie her." I tensed as the ropes around my wrists were cut. The moment my hands were free, I resisted the urge to rub the sore skin. Instead, I kept my gaze locked on the man in front of me. "Let's talk," he said, folding his hands once more. "Tell me, Claire, what do you think is happening here?" I hesitated. Was this a test? A trap? I decided to be honest. "I think Vernon isn't in charge." "I think you are. And I think Ivy is caught in something she can't escape." His smile grew. "Very good. But you're only half right." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward slightly. Vernon was never in charge. He was a pawn. A necessary piece in a much larger game. My stomach twisted. "Then who is in charge?" He studied me for a moment before answering. People much more powerful than you could ever imagine. People who don't take kindly to being interfered with. A shiver ran down my spine. Then why am I still alive? His expression darkened, just slightly. Because I find you useful. I didn't like the sound of that. What do you want from me? I asked warily. He tilted his head. I want to offer you a choice. I clenched my fists beneath the table. What kind of choice? His smile returned. Help me find someone. In return, I'll let you walk away from this. And I'll even tell you where Ivy is. I wasn't stupid. Deals like this never came without consequences. But I also knew one thing for sure, I needed to find Ivy. I took a slow breath. Who do you want me to find? His smile widened, and for the first time, I felt real fear settle into my bones. A ghost. The word hung in the air like an unspoken curse. A ghost? I repeated, my voice steady, though my insides churned. The man behind the desk nodded, his cold, calculated smile never wavering. Yes. Someone who should no longer exist. Someone who vanished years ago, and yet. I believe they are closer than we realize. I swallowed hard. And you think I can find them? He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the polished wood. I don't think, I know. I resisted the urge to glance at my captor, the man who had been watching me since I arrived. His posture was relaxed, but I wasn't fooled. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to strike if I made the wrong move. What makes you so sure? I asked, stalling for time. I needed to think. Every instinct I had screamed that this was a trap. But walking away wasn't an option, not without Ivy. Because you're already closer to them than anyone else has been in years. The room felt colder. Who is it? His smile widened. Your father. My stomach lurched. The floor beneath me seemed to shift, tilting at an unnatural angle. I gripped the arms of the chair to keep myself steady. My father is dead. A knowing glint flashed in his eyes. Is he? I had spent years mourning him. Years accepting that the man who had raised me, who had taught me how to fight, how to survive, had died in a car accident. I had visited his grave, touched the cold stone with my own hands. This was a lie. It had to be. I don't believe you, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. What if I told you that he faked his death? That he disappeared to protect you? My pulse pounded in my ears. From what? From me. The weight of his words crushed the air from my lungs. My father had been running from this man. And now I had walked straight into his grasp. I forced myself to breathe, to push the panic aside. And what do you want with him? He studied me carefully, as if weighing how much to reveal. He has something that belongs to me. A ledger. A very important one. A book? I frowned. You kidnapped me over a book? Not just a book. His eyes darkened. It contains information that could dismantle everything I've built. Bank accounts, names, records, evidence that could destroy the very foundation of this empire. I stared at him, realization dawning. And you think my father left it with me? His smile returned. You're smarter than you look. I clenched my fists beneath the table. This wasn't just about Ivy anymore. This was about my father, about secrets I had never known existed. I had been searching for Ivy, but now I was the one being hunted. What if I refuse? I asked. His expression remained unreadable. Then Ivy dies. A sharp breath caught in my throat. You don't have her. Are you sure? His voice was casual, as if we were discussing the weather. Would you like to hear her scream? I went rigid. The blood drained from my face. He pulled out a phone, tapped a few buttons, and held it up. Static crackled before a voice pierced through. "Claire, please. Please don't." Ivy's scream was cut off by a muffled thud. Then silence. My entire body shook. "You bastard." He lowered the phone. "Find the ledger. Bring it to me. Then you both walk free." I inhaled shakily. "And if I don't?" He shrugged. "Then I make sure you both disappear." The threat was real. And I had no doubt he would follow through. I had no choice. I nodded. "Where do I start?" His grin was slow, victorious. "That's the spirit." He slid a folder across the table. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single photograph. My father. He looked older, weary, his face partially shadowed by a hood. But it was him. And the timestamp in the corner told me it was taken just 3 months ago. My father was alive. A rush of emotions threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced them down. I couldn't afford to break now. I looked up at the man who held my fate in his hands. "And if I find him?" "Bring him to me," he said simply. "Alive." I clenched my jaw. "And Ivy?" "She stays with me until you deliver." My chest ached with the weight of the decision before me. But I had no other option. I took the folder, stood, and walked toward the door. The moment my hand touched the handle, he spoke one last time. "Claire." I turned, barely holding back the fury boiling beneath my skin. "Don't run," he said, his voice like ice. "Because if you do, I will make sure you regret it." I held his gaze. "You don't scare me." His smile widened. "You should be." I walked out without looking back. I had just made a deal with the devil. And now, I had to find a ghost. The night air was thick with tension as I left the mansion, the weight of my task pressing down on me like an iron chain. My father, alive. A ledger, dangerous enough to dismantle an empire. And Ivy, held hostage, her life hanging by a thread. I had been given an impossible mission, but failure wasn't an option. The driver, the same stone-faced man from before, waited beside the sleek black car. His gaze flickered over me, but he said nothing as he opened the door. I slid inside, gripping the folder so tightly my knuckles ached. As the car pulled away from the estate, I let out a slow, measured breath. I needed a plan. If my father had truly faked his death, it meant he had spent years hiding. If he was still alive, it meant he was good at it. And now, I had to find him before my captors did. The problem? I had no idea where to start. I flipped open the folder, my eyes scanning the photograph again. My father, older, his face shadowed but unmistakably his. The timestamp confirmed that it was taken only 3 months ago. Whoever had captured this image had been close. Then I saw it. A faint reflection in the glass behind him. A neon sign, blurred but still legible, Harrington's Diner. My pulse quickened. I knew that place. It was an old 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Chicago, a relic of the past that somehow never shut down. If he had been spotted there, it meant he was either passing through or using it as a meeting place. Either way, it was my first real lead. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Where to?" "Harrington's Diner," I said, keeping my voice steady. He nodded, not questioning it. The car changed direction, heading toward the interstate. I had to be smart. The man in charge, whoever he was, expected me to bring my father in. But if I found him first, I had the leverage. If he truly had that ledger, then I had a way to negotiate. Maybe even a way to get Ivy out alive. The drive to the diner took hours, but I barely noticed. My mind raced through possibilities, running through every potential outcome. By the time we arrived, the sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Harrington's diner sat at the edge of a deserted lot, its neon sign flickering weakly. It looked the same as it had years ago, worn down but still standing, an island of familiarity in an ocean of uncertainty. I stepped out of the car. "Stay here." The driver didn't argue. I pulled my coat tighter around me and walked toward the entrance, pushing open the heavy glass door. The smell of coffee and stale grease hit me immediately. A few night shift workers sat hunched over their meals, but the place was mostly empty. I scanned the room, my heart pounding. Then, in the farthest booth, I saw him. My father. I froze. He looked up from his cup of coffee, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he set his cup down. "Claire." Hearing him say my name nearly broke me. I walked toward him, every step heavier than the last. I slid into the booth across from him, my throat tightening. "You're alive," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave me a tired smile. "And you found me." "I had help," I admitted, placing the folder on the table. "They think you have something." "A ledger." His expression didn't change, but his hands tensed around his cup. "And if I do?" "Then we're in trouble," I said honestly. "They have Ivy." His face darkened. "Vernon's people?" I shook my head. "No. Someone above him. Someone more dangerous." He exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "I always knew this would catch up to me." "Then help me," I pleaded. "Give them what they want so we can get Ivy back." He studied me for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right. But we do this on my terms." A sense of relief flooded through me. Then I heard it. The sound of a car door slamming outside. I turned just in time to see two men in dark suits stepping out of a black SUV. They had followed me. Panic shot through me, but my father remained calm. "We have to go. Now." I grabbed the folder, stuffing it back into my coat as we slid out of the booth. The men outside hadn't seen us yet, but it wouldn't be long. We darted toward the back exit, slipping into the alley just as the front door opened. My father led the way, moving quickly despite his age. A second later, gunfire shattered the quiet morning air. I ducked instinctively, my heart hammering. "They're shooting at us?" My father didn't slow. "They don't need us alive." Adrenaline surged through me as we ran, weaving through alleyways, the sound of footsteps growing closer behind us. Then, up ahead, a car screeched to a stop. The back door flew open. "In," a voice barked. I recognized the driver instantly. It was the same man who had brought me here. But there was no time to hesitate. We dove inside, and the car peeled away from the curb, tires screeching against the pavement. I turned to my father, breathing heavily. "We have to end this." He nodded. "And I know exactly how."